The flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you.
Trial by Fire by Matthew Iden. Narrated by Diane Severson. Diane rubbed the rough cloth of her robe between forefinger and thumb, exquisitely aware of the texture of the warp and weave. Each tiny square was arranged row upon row, a perfectly disciplined gathering of fabric that only failed at the torn edge, where the threads became a riot of loose ends, disorderly, unruly, damaged. Her fingers left the neat rows of the cloth and explored the tear where wisps of thread trailed from their more well-behaved beginnings. They had the texture of hair, their torn ends softer and more delicate than the tightly woven strands they came from. Diane's hand traced the split from where it began near the throat of her robe, following it with delicate care over her breasts and down to her waist, where the cloth eventually came together again past her thighs. The perfect structure of the cloth meant that the tear followed a straight line from chin to crotch. Her hands stopped their exploration just past her navel, at the wetness there, and retreated back up the ragged edge of the cloth to her face, which throbbed in time to her heartbeat, the thing that told her she was still alive. There was more wetness along her hairline, but this was blood, only blood, from the cut in her scalp. It stung where it slipped into the corner of her right eye, became sticky where it dried on her skin. Almost a full cycle passed before the Rood found her, wedged between a raft of storage crates in the warehouse, bleeding and barely conscious. Though her hands moved convulsively and continuously, trying to pull the two halves of her robe together and failing, just as they had for hours. On a different planet, in a different century, a charismatic high minister of the Church of the New Calvinist used the wealth and influence of his congregation to petition and receive a charter for the settlement of a planet along the outermost rim of known space. The colonists of the newly discovered world would be taken from the congregation only, and not even all of them would be considered. Only the holy, the dedicated, and the industrious would be chosen to join the new shining city on the hill. The rock was so far removed from the main interstellar commercial lines and mining traffic that the original spacefaring homesteaders had dubbed the place Exile. But footing the bill for a planetary charter, costing the equivalent of a small country's GDP, entitled the colonists to rename the planet any way they pleased. And that name, as a symbol of their faith and their determination, was critical. For this reason, and unlike any other undertaking of any importance made by the New Calvinists, the name of the congregation's new home was put to a vote. New Jerusalem, Bountiful, and Sanctuary were all considered, then discarded as either too presumptive, too unrealistic, or impious. Laying claim to any kind of salvation or success before it was earned was flirting with blasphemy. The settlers knew their future would be an uncertain, probably brutal one, and only with the help of the Lord would they thrive. If they were found worthy, and survived long enough to flourish, then, and only then, would they rename the planet. Until then, their planet would be known as Trial. Even as a little girl, wrapped in the black polycloth habit and wimple required of all females, she had been drawn to the source at the center of the great nave. While other boys and girls her age tempted the elders' wrath playing tag and space shuttle in the empty mine shafts and freight corridors, she would slink along the walls of the great vaulted chamber, hugging their frigid bulk, until she'd gathered the courage to cross the cold stone floor and kneel by the edge of the permacrete dais upon which the source rested. She would stare at the shifting fire, watching the amber and scarlet light until her eyes watered and her head spun. The sides of the high dais had been carved over time with scenes of hardship and sacrifice. A set of 10 ancient steps, saddled by age, led up the dais to the source, even, perhaps, into the heart of its flame, but only the ancient, some elders, and the rude dared set foot on its steps. Sometimes, with her face pressed against the warm stone-like crete and her eyes swimming with tears, she would hear the source whispering to her. Never words, nothing so clear or articulate. They were more like the memories of emotions once felt, the grief she'd felt when she'd been told her father had died deep in the mines, the braided threads of joy and sadness the night Jamie had come to Jahan and her mother to tell them he'd been accepted as an acolyte, and would be forbidden to speak to them until he'd become an elder. When her mother had passed not long after, those memories made sense, but sometimes the whispers coming from the source confused her. Not all of the visions made sense, and they were never clear. Sometimes she wasn't sure they were even hers. The lack of clarity was maddening. From time to time, when she couldn't resist any more and her chores were done, Jahan would creep into the nave and tiptoe to the bottom step. She would lean against it, holding her breath with her heart in her throat, listening for the soft, whisking footsteps of sandaled feet in the hall. When she was sure she was alone, if she dared, she would crawl onto the first step, ready to jump to the floor with an explanation on her lips. But if no one came, she would ease to the second, then the third, half expecting to be struck down by some mighty invisible hand. When she wasn't, she wondered why it was a sin to climb the steps as the ancient and the elders claimed. Heat radiated from the source, warm even from 10 feet away. It felt good. The rooms and corridors of trial were as cold as old bones, and the power generated by the failing pocket reactor for the underground community was for cleaning air, fueling the few working diggers, and lighting lamps for reading scripture. Hard work, thick clothes, and obedience will warm you, the rude would say when children, even huddled together, complained about the cold. She had other sayings ready when that wasn't sufficient. Busy hands will warm a heart, and a chill is forgotten when a conscience is clear. And when all else failed, simply, faith is required, and a stern look. After that, there would be no more complaints. But no dictum of the Rude's would compare to the heat that rolled down the steps from the source. With the whispers in her head and the warmth enveloping her, Jahan would slip into a daze, blind and enraptured, until she came to with a gasp on the 6th or 7th step, almost within reach of the fire, sweat prickling her scalp, and scuttled down the steps, her heart pounding. She'd been caught just once when she was 12. By then, she'd been hearing the source for years, and the constant voices made it impossible for her to stay away. Unable to resist the call, she'd follow the voices to the nave almost every week, creeping up the steps, trying to understand. Once, the whispering had been just one voice, then it became a dozen, then 100. Now it sounded like an arena full of hushed voices, not one of them intelligible. She'd crouched on the 3rd step, her eyes locked on the flickering center of the source with the voices loud in her head, when, too late, she'd heard a soft scuff behind her. She whipped around to run, but a hand with an iron grip grabbed her by the hair, wimple and all, and threw her down the steps. Jahan lay on the floor of the nave staring into the dark recesses of the vault. The wind knocked out of her, gasping for air. Eyes wide, she stared at the ceiling, unsure what had happened. Then the alabaster face of the Rude came into view, the woman's roomy eyes gazing down at her like some specimen in an ancient textbook. The woman examined Jahan for a long minute before speaking. When she did, her voice was low and quiet, but harsh as a grinding stone. "Do you know how very lucky you are, child, that it was I that found you, and not Elder Grappin?" Jahan squirmed and bucked, panicking as she failed to catch her breath. The Rude made no move to help. She continued, "The Elder would have beaten you until your blood pooled around you, and you would lay there and thank him, for anything else is mutinous and a sin in the eyes of the Lord. Why, in the name of all that is holy, were you climbing the steps of the source?" Jahan swallowed and coughed. rolling on her side and bringing her knees to her chest to ease the clenching in her chest. Her voice was a croak. "It was warm, Mother Rood. I am cold all the time. I was hoping to warm myself for a moment." For a long moment the Rood looked at her. Then her eyes narrowed to slits. "Lie to me again, child, and I'll drag you before the Ancient by your hair." Fear rolled over Jehan. The threat made her quiver. The truth seemed too strange to admit. But when the Rood made to get to her feet, Jehan blurted, "I feel things, Mother Rood." "Explain." The Rood pointed at her with a bony finger. "And do not lie." I hear voices." "From?" "The source," Jehan whispered. "The source speaks to me." "Blasphemous," the Rood said, her eyes widening. "Mutinous." Jehan propped herself on an elbow. "No, Mother Rood, it's true, I swear. The sound is beautiful, like the songs of angels. I don't know where they come from. But all I have to do is listen, and—" The Rood's hand snaked out and struck her an open-handed blow across the face. Jehan cried out, as much from the shock as the pain. The Ancient and the Elders and the Acolytes wouldn't hesitate to beat their flock to instill faith. But the Rood and the sisters were forbidden to raise their hand to anyone. "Never," the Rood said, her hands clenched into fists like knots of bone. "Never repeat that. Never tell anyone what you have said to me. Do you understand?" From the ground, Jehan nodded, numb, but the Rood had already risen and hurried from the nave without a backward glance. Jehan climbed to her feet, shaking, and stumbled out of the chamber, afraid that the woman would change her mind and send one of the acolytes to thrash her anyway. As time passed, the colonists of Trial did not flourish, but they did survive, content to practice their religion in their own dark corner of known space. But it was soon evident that faith alone wouldn't be enough to sustain the outpost. The Lord might provide, but Trial, like any interstellar colony, needed basic supplies and a way of trading for them. But the same isolation that gave the colony the ability to worship in peace was also the handicap that kept it impoverished. And they had worked to make that isolation. The original trip to the new planet had been made in aging shuttles purchased and pressed into service as one-way freighters, their hulks carefully outfitted and modified for future cannibalization. Only the lure of profit, after the desolate little space rock was found to contain decent amounts of lanthanum, nickel, and erbium, helped restore contact with the rest of humanity. The last two elements, the prime ingredient for high-quality cryo-coolers necessary for long-distance interstellar travel, were enough to convince desperate and adventurous outsider traders to make the long haul to Trial to strike a deal. The exchanges were distasteful to both parties, but contact with the traders was a web-thin umbilical cord to the rest of humanity. Tenuous as it was still enough to keep the colony connected to the rest of their race. And then the cord was severed. Once interstellar travel was improved to sub-FTL speeds, and cryocoolers were things only found in history books and in planetary junk orbits, there wasn't a two-way fighter captain in the universe willing to make the hellacious journey to Trial for the miserly gains to be made. Contact with the outside slowed, then stopped. Eventually, the little religious enclave was abandoned, a tiny flame flickering in an otherwise forgotten corner of the void. Whispers, like traces of smoke, trailed, swelled, then disappeared as Jehan walked down the hall to join the rest of the faithful for the morning's instruction. Her eyes were downcast, but her steps firm and measured as she passed the dormitories and work quarters of the others. By the time she filed into the nave and took her place next to her sisters, the whispers had swelled to a rush of sound, throttled only when the Ancient raised his hands from his place on the first step of the dais. Flanked by the 10 elders, who were in turn trailed by a small regiment of acolytes, The ancient opened the morning's instructions on the necessities of duty and sacrifice. Jahan stood and recited the catechism woodenly, her hands squeezing her fingers bloodless. She was aware that all around her, members of the faithful were looking at her, lifting their eyes to peer at her in between reciting their lines. Some nudged neighbors who hadn't noticed yet, and soon it felt as if the entire nave was staring at her. Several of the elders sensed the ripple of unrest, and out of the corner of her eye, Jahan saw Elder Grappin, the man responsible for keeping order in the flock, turn to several of his acolytes and point to the crowd. 4 of the holy servants pulled rods from slings on their belts and began walking the aisles of the congregation. The threat of a beating was enough to return the attention of most wandering eyes towards slippers and sandals. For some, however, the temptation to peek was too great. A thud, followed by a muffled cry of pain, marked when an acolyte believed one of the faithful was being inattentive during the ancient's droning sermon. Jahan pinned her eyes to the floor, unwilling to suffer a similar punishment, especially if it would come at the hands of her brother Jamie, the youngest acolyte, and one of those selected to roam the congregation. Eventually, focus was restored and the acolytes returned to their positions. The ancient mumbled through the remainder of the instruction, and the faithful waited for his raised arms to signal the end of the lesson. As he did so, Jahan risked raising her own eyes from the floor, but instead of watching the familiar and comforting figure of the ancient or the stern yet somehow reassuring frown of the rude, Jahan's eyes were drawn to the squared-off features of Elder Grappin. They locked gazes across the nave, his brown eyes boring into hers. She held his stare for a long moment. Then his eyes dropped to gaze at her robes, still torn and gaping from where they'd been ripped off her. On testing and obedience, to be recited during instruction. Elder. The center of our belief is the miracle brought to trial by a woman of the first, the original faithful. The faithful.
The flame was her most prized possession, her love of it venal, rivaling her faith in the Lord.
Elder. The flame blossomed and shrank according to the vessel it occupied, but in all ways was perpetual and everlasting. The faithful.
For many months the first revealed the flame in secret and called it holy.
Elder. The ancient was wroth when he discovered the flame. Idolatry he called it, iconolatry. The faithful.
But when he understood the blessed nature of the flame, he recanted and relented and named the flame.
Elder. A miracle. The faithful.
Iden.
All.
The source.
The faithful.
The source was raised to a place of honor, a reminder of the Lord's grace and the purging nature of his love.
Elder. And as an instrument of his testing, for when the first demon appeared from the flame to offer the faithful the temptations of the outer world, he seemed both blessing and a source of succor. The faithful.
But the demon praised the heresies of the outer world, poisoning the thoughts of the flock, offering only damnation.
Elder. The ancient pronounced blasphemy, ordering the demon to be crushed under the rocks of the mines. But many of the flock had become corrupt. They clamored for change, and the ancient pronounced them tainted also. The faithful.
The mutinous were burnt by the flames of the holy fire, and their souls condemned.
Elder. The faithful knew then not to trust the whisperings of demons, and the next to appear was attacked and cast out. Then did the good folk know that they had been found pleasing in the sight of the Lord, for never again did demons appear from the source. all.
The faithful thanked the Lord for his guidance and mercy, but ever and anon swore to remain vigilant. Amen.
Afraid there would be nightmares, Jahan worked herself to exhaustion, but the memories came when she was doing the everyday things of her life, not when she slept. She would be tutoring the young children, and from nowhere she would smell his breath like sour bread, and she would have to run from the room. Or taking meals in the common hall with the others watching her, staring at her, she would suddenly feel his lips worrying her neck like some kind of hairless animal. She felt like two different people split down the center. One Jahan went about her life like any of the other faithful, working at the tasks that all had to take part in, going to instruction, contemplating her place in the enclave. The other Jahan screamed and drooled and shouted inside her skull, threatening to burst out. Sometimes her scalp prickled. She felt so close to coming undone. To calm herself, she would grab the two halves of her torn robe and rub the soft wisps of thread along the edges. But sometimes that wasn't enough. Thoughts of blood and fire tore through her mind, and she imagined killing everyone she knew, ripping and tearing them apart until there was nothing left. At those times, the voices from the source turned from whispers to shouts, merging with the screaming Jahan inside her until she wasn't sure which she was hearing. Desperate to quiet the voices, Jahan would flee to the abandoned mines below the colony. The drillers and track haulers lining the corridors had been defunct for decades, silent and ossified, but the off-world steel they were made of was better than anything the colony had ever produced on its own. One massive digger she'd discovered in her childhood, when she'd ventured farther than anyone else, had a shattered thresh plate on its front. Like some industrial mouth, the thresh plate chewed away at the rock by grinding its dozens of small teeth into the walls of the mine. But all things break, and although it had been one of the last, this digger had stopped working years ago. With no one from the outside to repair or replace it, dead it had stayed. Scattered on the ground around the digger were the teeth that had been chipped off on its last run. Wedge-shaped, with a needle-like point and sharpened sides, the thing looked more at home in an outsider storybook about monsters than a tool for mining erbium. The back end of each tooth had a squared metal tang that had once mounted into the mouth of the digger. With the tang, the whole thing was almost a foot long. Jahan chose one and picked it up, testing the point. Not nearly good enough to eat rock, it was still sharp enough to pierce skin. She pressed it into her palm until the edge left a dull red streak. Both edges were dull, but anyone who had worked in the kitchens knew how to sharpen a knife. A wrap of polycloth and glue around the tang would make a serviceable grip. She stared at the point, fascinated by the symmetry and fatality of it. Whispers of suggestion and action flitted past her mind, eventually melding with the screaming of the silent Jahan that had been deafening her, roaring in her brain, obliterating her. Without conscious thought, she raised her hand until the point rested on her neck, just above her collarbone. She imagined she could feel the throb of her vein, pulsing against the skin on one side. On the other, death ground to a fine point. Closing her eyes, she pushed the knife deeper until her skin dimpled inward. She swallowed, and the movement was enough to cause a small red pearl to form at the point, then trickle down her neck. Jahan stayed that way for long minutes, until the screaming in her head began to fade, going from a hoarse shout to a mumble, then finally a whimper. The tooth in her hand seemed like a gateway to a vision, its point not the departure place for death, but that of separation, of the dividing line between her youth and her past, from her future and her life. It begat its own sense of freedom, a quick peek behind the curtain of revelation, the sham of the elders' sense of righteousness, the wobbly construction of their leader's vision, the meaning and existence of trial itself. She lowered the makeshift knife from her throat and slipped it under her robes, hidden and safe against her flesh. She dabbed at the blood. When she had come to the mines, she'd been sobbing. Now she took deep, clear breaths, and her head swam with the thoughts and feelings flooding her mind. The whimpering voice in her head became once again the whispering of the source, comforting and familiar. "All I'm saying is that I'm not sure I understood what the ancient was teaching," Delia said, raising her voice over the sound of splashing water. Her assignment, as well as that of Jehan and 6 other women that week, was laundering, and they were busy emptying the grey water of the laundry tubs into the recycler. "At the end of every instruction we say the Lord is merciful, yet the lesson is about the burning of the mutinous ones. It doesn't make sense to me." "The mutinous ones aren't part of the faithful," Torah responded primly. She was older, a mother of 2. "They aren't worthy of the Lord's mercy." "Why not?" Torah sighed. "Because they're not. Only the faithful and those who would become faithful are worthy." "How do we know that?" Delia persisted. "Faith is required," recited one of the other women by rote. Torah and several of the others nodded as they worked, never stopping even as they talked. It wasn't worth having the rude find them chatting and not keeping their hands busy, even if the topic of conversation was the day's instruction. "I have faith," Delia said, splashing as she duck-walked her tub over to the lip of the recycler. "It should be strong enough to stand up to a few questions, though." "It isn't," Jehan said suddenly. The others paused for a shocked moment, then began again. "Isn't what?" Delia asked. All of the women had been avoiding looking at Jehan and her torn shift. The entire enclave had been looking away from it. "Your faith. It isn't strong enough, because the faith is misplaced." Several women muttered, "Mutinous," but softly, under the breath. Delia swallowed. "Why do you say that?" "Faith is direct," Jehan said, keeping her head bent to her task as she scrubbed at a pair of overalls from the workers' quarters. "The ancient, the elders, the rude, they're all just mouthpieces, and they can misinterpret and misunderstand and even pervert the message of faith. They are not holy." Without a word, Torah dropped her brush and walked out of the laundry room. The other women watched her go, looked at each other, then 2 of them followed. Delia watched them leave, then turned her head towards Jehan. "If they aren't holy, then how are we to learn?" "The source," Jehan said simply. "It speaks. Listen. It will guide when these old men fail. You don't need their intervention. They take the Lord's word and twist it to their own ends. They are the mutinous ones, the blasphemous ones." 2 of the women gasped. Delia put her wash down, looking queasy. At that moment there was a scuffling noise from the hall, and the Rood appeared in the doorway. Torah peered from behind her into the room. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, stalking into the room. "She was speaking mutiny, Mother Rood," Torah said, pointing at Jehan. Delia and the other backed into the corner of the room, eyes wide. "She questioned the ancient and the elders. She called them unholy." "Is this true?" the Rood asked, glaring at the girl. "Yes," Jehan said, smiling and wiping her hands on her robe as she straightened to face the older woman. "I speak the truth. You are a charlatan, unworthy, as are the old men you follow." "Mutiny!" the Rood gasped, then strode towards the girl, her hand raised. Jehan stepped forward, meeting the other woman halfway, and backhanded her across the mouth with the sound of 2 boards being clapped together. The Rood staggered back, a look of shock on her face, and fell over a washtub. The other women gasped, and several fled the laundry room, their hands to their mouths. Half conscious, the Rood thrashed on the floor, trying to get to her feet. Jehan walked past a shocked Delia to tower over her former teacher. Looking down, she pointed at the old woman and said, "The only truth is from the Lord, and his only messenger is the source." Then she walked out, leaving the other women to help the bewildered Rood to her feet and off to her quarters. There were no whispers now as Jehan made her way to instruction, simply frightened silence as she passed down the hall. Eyes slid away from hers as she walked, and several lowered their heads in prayer. Her head was held high this time, and she looked directly at the others in her enclave, daring them to look at her, or the torn robes that had become her symbol. She took her place with the others as the entire community gathered for instruction. The air thrummed with tension as the acolytes, then the elders, and finally the ancient filed into the chamber. The ancient began with the invocation, reciting the words in his weak voice that had quavered since Jehan had been a little girl. As he finished, however, the acolytes filed in slow procession away from the dais and began spreading throughout the room. A collective shudder rippled through the room as the faithful anticipated a beating or a castigation, but the acolytes simply stood at the ends of the rows and waited for the invocation to end. The ancient turned and nodded to Elder Grappen, where he stood, second in the line of elders. Elder Grappen bowed, then walked to the center of the nave, turning in place so as to lock eyes with members of the congregation. "From time to time it comes to pass," he began, "that our faith is tested, that our strength of character is challenged. And so it must be, for belief without proof is empty and hollow." He swept his gaze over the mass of people. "As we have learned from instruction, corruption and change come not only from outside. The seed of discord and sin can also foment from within." Grappen nodded, and Jehan cried out in surprise as two acolytes, one of them Jamie, grabbed her roughly by the arms and pulled her from the row. Faces grim, they dragged her in front of the elder as the voices of the faithful swelled and rippled, filling the nave. "But," Grappen continued, raising his voice to a shout to be overheard over the enclave, "we must remain true in the face of these tests. Vigilance is all, for we must root out and destroy the source of the sin before it is allowed to fester and take root." Jamie and the other acolyte forced Jehan to her knees before the elder, who raised both hands high into the air. "Jehan, be it known that you have sinned in the eyes of the faithful, and of your elders, and in the eyes of the Lord. For your transgressions of heresy and insubordination you shall be punished. But the Lord is merciful and forgives all who would ask it. The ancient and I have consulted, and deem that you are worthy of that opportunity. Jehan, I take thee to wife, and shall henceforth promise to school thee in the ways of the Lord, as is my duty and right as an elder of our church." Eyes wide, panicking, Jehan recoiled as Grappen, smiling, reached down with a large hand to raise her to her feet. The smile dropped from his face as she shrank from his touch, and he grabbed her roughly by the shift, the same one he had torn open weeks before. A shriek spilled out of Jehan, an animal cry ripped from the bottom of her stomach. She clawed inside her tunic and wrapped her hand around the makeshift knife she'd made from the digger's tooth. Struggling against Grappen's grip, she pulled the tooth out and stabbed upward into his ribs, only stopping when the rough hilt of the knife pinned his robes to his body. A scream rose from the congregation as Grappen staggered back and fell to the ground. Some began to wail, others fell to their knees and began praying. The line of acolytes and elders surged forward, shouting. The ancient, eyes wide enough to show the whites, raised his arms and began yelling hoarsely from the steps of the dais. Several acolytes dragged the wounded elder to a corner of the nave, while others attacked Jehan, beating her with their rods. The girl covered her head and neck as the blows rained down, bruising and breaking. For Jehan, Cutting through it all, smothering the pain, was the roar that was the voice of the source. Initially drowned out in the chaos that had taken over the nave, the voice reached a screaming crescendo, filling her head and her ears and her mind. Even as the ancient instructed the remaining elders to hold her hands and feet, then lift her up the steps of the dais, and finally to throw her into the raging fire of the source, Jahan heard nothing, felt nothing, but the swelling music of the flames. Serenity obliterated the pain and the chaos around her, replacing the heat of the fire with the purest sense of fulfillment and completeness she'd ever known. From the floor of the nave, the enclave watched in horror after Jahan was thrown bodily into the purifying icon of their religion. Expecting to see her scream and burn, they instead began to wail and cry out anew as Jahan, bloody and broken, rose unsteadily in the center of the flames and, with an expression of pure bliss, raised her arms above her head and disappeared. She was with God. It was the only explanation for the simultaneous sense of calm and absence. The whispers she had heard her whole life were a song. There was only thought, no movement, no feelings of pain or anxiety, no recognition of time. She imagined herself as a single atom, resting on the skirt of the Lord's robes, part of the fabric of the whole, but happily insignificant, resting, alone, but as one with all, at peace. Jahan gasped as she tumbled down a short set of stairs, coming to rest in a painful heap at their base. Broken bones ground against one another and bruised back muscles spasmed as she struggled to sit. The pain was excruciating, and she stopped trying. Over the agony, an overwhelming feeling of sadness filled her as she realized she had left the null space, that she was no longer sleeping on the skirts of God. No, she was lying on a very real, very hard permacrete floor, cold and as unyielding as the stones of the nave. She was in a small, square room, hardly larger than her own sleeping quarters, and even emptier. A strange, sweet burnt smell hung in the air, and the room was silent except for a slight mechanical hum coming from an unseen source. Dim light spilled from cup-like sconces along the wall, and a dancing light played on the walls. She turned her head to the flickering and gasped as she saw a tall flame, not nearly as large as the source, but still man-sized, at the top of a dais that was the sister to the one she'd known all her life. This one was more functional, lacking the carvings on its base. And was that a railing leading down the steps? The feeling of the place was alien. Confusion and fear started to well up inside her, threatening to crest until she reached out with her mind, casting about for anything familiar and safe. She discovered the comforting whispers she'd always known playing quietly in the corners of her thoughts, tiny, but there, and the fear faded away. A whisking sound in the real world made her turn her head, and she saw a figure walking by the doorway to the room. The figure gave a start, then hurried into the room and over to her side. A middle-aged man with bushy, iron-gray hair and a mustache to match, dressed in a strange set of faded blue overalls, knelt and leaned over her. There was a tattered brown stick in one corner of his mouth, and a worried expression on his face. He reached out to touch her, then pulled his hand away. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he said in strangely accented speech, talking around the stick. "You look like the dog's dinner. We weren't expecting a ferryman for a couple of weeks. Didn't think they'd show up burnt, beat, and broken. Where in Kepler's name did you shift in from, girl?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. He tisked and pulled a flask from a hip pocket, then trickled some of its contents down her throat and waited for the coughing to stop. "Trial," she croaked. I'm from trial. He quirked an eyebrow, then shook his head. Don't know it. Doesn't look like any place I'd like to visit, neither. She searched his face. Have I died? Is this heaven? An expression of pure amusement came over his face, twisting an already broken nose to one side. Unable to help himself, he laughed. No, miss, this ain't heaven. It's called Ark, since we are on the bend of the old freighter run. We're just a little speck of miners and ne'er-do-wells, hanging on to the edge of known space with both hands. Judging by where you came from, though, it's still a bit better than hell. The ancient watched as Elder Grappin was carried to his quarters by a handful of dedicated acolytes, his lifeblood trailing from the nave. The Rood and her sisters followed to give what help they could. In the coming days, the man would suffer and die, the rudimentary medicine of the colony no match for the wound he had sustained. After his death, only the man's holiness and faith would be remembered, and in time he would become a martyr and Trial's first saint. But for now, knowing that his tiny enclave was on the verge of madness and collapse, the ancient quickly led the frightened men and women in a prayer of thankfulness and celebration, and not a little repentance, for their vigilance had not been sufficient, and their sacrifice had almost not been enough to banish the evil that had been born and walked among them, the demon Jahan.
Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com.